Hello, and welcome this time as we come to the 29th year of the A year, Sunday of the year. And the readings this time come again from the prophet Isaiah, this time chapter 45, verse 1 and verses 4 through 6. The second reading comes from Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. It's the beginning of that letter. So it's chapter 1, verses 1 through 5b. And finally, the gospel comes from Matthew chapter 22 through verses 15 through 21. So let me begin by pointing out that chapter 22 really will involve 4 episodes in which Jesus is entering into what we call controversies. Now you will remember that over the last couple of weeks we had a series, 3 parables that Jesus is pictured as directing against the leadership of Jerusalem, namely the chief priests and the elders. And now these controversies break out. We believe that Jesus is now in the temple area. The pattern that is established here was that by Mark, and Matthew makes some changes in the course of his discussion. Now, just to flesh out what happens in chapter 22, because we're only going to be hearing over this week and next week certain sections from that chapter. These 4 controversies that break out have to do with the taxes relegated to whether they should be paid, that is relegated to Caesar, the question of the resurrection, the question of the greatest commandment, and the question of David's son. Now we will be choosing from Matthew this time, just 2 of those 4. So again, I always encourage us to get a kind of overview of the particular gospel, and in this case, Matthew, and how he is developing his presentation. So what we will be hearing or listening to is chapter 22, as I say, verses 15. We've looked at earlier on at parts of this chapter last time. So how does it begin? Well, it begins this time by the introduction of the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees have not been mentioned really recently in Matthew's gospel. They certainly are mentioned in Matthew's gospel. And as we have pointed out a number of times, try to remember that the Pharisees here that Jesus is pictured as dealing with in Matthew's gospel would not have been the Pharisees in Jesus' time. Now, why is that important? Because the Pharisees in Matthew's time were those who were restructuring Judaism after the fall of the city of Jerusalem under the armies of Rome in the year 70. We've mentioned this before, but I mention it again, just that we are kind of affirming the nature of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were, certainly in Jesus' time, a rather, you remember, popular group. They were made of laymen, they were scholars, they were basically teachers, but they were not priests. And they had very little to do with what went on up in Jerusalem, particularly in the temple area. They were also a variety of Jewish communities who looked at the reality of Judaism from different perspectives, so that the understanding of Judaism from the viewpoint of the Pharisees was one of a few. Now, some say there were as many as 20, but we don't know what those are, and the ones that we do know basically have been preserved for us by the gospel writers. Otherwise, we wouldn't even know some of the things that they believed in. But when we come to the time of Matthew, keep in mind that the Pharisees were the surviving group of Judaism, and that they were pulling together Jewish practice and thought, building upon an old tradition that where 10 men, sorry ladies, a minion of Jews were present, there was Israel. And that the basis for Israel's reality was built on the covenant that had been made by God with Israel through Moses during the Sinai experience when they were wandering in the wilderness. So you remember, and this basic community of Judaism, which we might call Second Temple Judaism, although the temple had been destroyed, is the brand of Judaism that pretty much remains in place even through the centuries to our own time. Now I say that because there are obviously variations and developments, just as there have been variations and developments in Christianity from the time of Matthew to our own time. So all of that, a little bit, again, a reminder that the Pharisees in Matthew's time were pictured as kind of arguing with a group of Jewish people who accepted Jesus as the Messiah. We would call them Christian Jews, although many different thinkers call them Jewish Christians. Well, is there a distinction? Well, think of which is the adjective that describes and which is the noun. So some thinkers would say that Matthew's group are basically Jewish who have accepted Jesus and therefore as the Messiah. Others say, well, they're already Christian and they bring in the concepts and understandings of Judaism. In that sense, then, that would be an adjective rather than a noun. Now, I leave that up to you to kind of reflect on. Different scholars argue or make the point in different ways, although it would seem that with the familiarity that Matthew's gospel has with Judaism, that the basic believers were also very familiar with the Jewish tradition. Now, as this episode unfolds, the Pharisees are united, pictured as with the Herodians. Now, we don't know a lot about the Herodians. All we could assume is that they would be a group of believers who somehow were associated with Herod Antipas, who you remember was the son of Herod the Great. And it is also true that after the fall, and we've mentioned this before, but I reaffirm this, after the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70, the Pharisee group moved from the south, namely Jerusalem, up to the north and settled in the Galilee. And that basically the place where they kind of set up headquarters was Tiberias. Now, in Jesus' time, Jews really avoided Tiberias, and we never hear Jesus in any of the Gospels teaching in or entering the city of Tiberias. All of that changed as a result of the fall of Jerusalem, and now, in many ways, it became the headquarters for the Pharisee movement, and therefore a kind of center for Judaism post destruction of Jerusalem. So, as this is pictured, we now get the Pharisees and the Herodians seeking to test Jesus. Well, maybe it's more than test, but the word is used to trap Jesus in his speech so that he can say something that will put him at odds, not only with the Jewish community, but with all who would hear this message. Now, in ancient Mediterranean culture, there is no way in which you can remain neutral, okay? So when a challenge is made, and we've noticed this on a number of occasions, when a challenge is made, it is generally against the honor of some group or some person. Today, we might kind of hope that certain groups especially given the circumstances that are breaking out in the world today, to a certain neutrality. But in the time of both Jesus and in the time of Matthew, the idea of neutrality was not one that could be accepted. So when this little attempt now on the part of some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to trap Jesus, notice that they're going after him. And they begin. Now, you have to kind of see that they are sort of clever in the way in which they start this. They begin with flattery, hoping, in this case, to catch Jesus off guard. And so they mention, and this now is the reading that we will be looking at, saying to Jesus, "We know that you are an honest," or perhaps another translation says, "a truthful man, and that you are only interested, the only authenticity that you back is that which is God. And we know that you're not concerned about anyone else's opinion. We just really know that you always stand for what is correct and what is truthful." Now, you got to admit, this little flattery could, if you're not prepared for it, catch one off guard. But Jesus is not caught off guard, because then immediately after giving all this kind of praise to Jesus, say, "Now, what about this? Is it lawful to pay the tax to the government or not?" Now that, again, remember, there's not a middle ground here. It's an either-or position. And Jesus, who is pictured as not being concerned about anyone's opinion, or does not look at anyone's status in life. Now that's interesting, because we've seen a number of times already in Matthew's gospel where that is true. Jesus is not interested so much in the social statuses of people. Remember, that was an issue last time when we looked at the king who invited those to the wedding feast of his son, where he was inviting those at first of his own status, and then he opened the door and invited everyone in. So it is true that it looks to be that Jesus was much more universal in his thinking than perhaps other rabbis, both of Jesus' time and even of Matthew's time, were. So they think now they have placed Jesus in an interesting position. Jesus responds to this plot to entrap him, both with irony, subtlety, and brilliance, by calling those who do this hypocrites. Now, we've seen that word used before. Matthew has used it also earlier in his gospel. Hypocrites, you remember, are those had to do with the theater, was a mask that was put on by the players, one of two masks, you remember, one either of suffering or one of happiness. And the mask covered what the real person was thinking. He could say whatever he wanted because it somehow was appropriate to the face that was shown to the audience. So Jesus here says, you have put on a face, but that's not really what you are concerned with. So, is it lawful to pay the tax or not? Now, we do know something about this tax. Remember that at this point in time, now again, are we talking about Jesus' time? Well, the emperor, and I will go to this in a minute, but the Emperor Tiberius was ruling the Roman Empire from the year 14 through 37. Now that would fit the time in which Jesus' public ministry took place. So he would have been the Roman ruler that was in charge of the empire during his public ministry. Earlier on, there had been another emperor, but this was the one now who would have been recognized as the legitimate Roman ruler. The tax that is being talked about here was known as the head tax or the poll tax, and it was required of every man, woman, and slave. Now, the word here is kenosis, K-E-N-S-O-S, and everyone between the ages of 12 through 65 were levied this tax. Now, what it turned out to be was, and it's interesting, a silver denarius. Now, a denarius was generally a day's wage. Why is the silver important? Because it had to do with a coin that had on it, remember now this would be a Roman coin, which had on it, on one side, the image of the emperor, and on the other side, a subscription. So the specific coin that is mentioned here, well, for those of you who are in Latin, this is what it would have said if you see this coin. Tiberius Caesar Divini Augustus Filius Augustus Pontifex Maximus. Now, translated in would be the Emperor Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of the divine Augustus, high priest. So, when Jesus now is questioned as to whether or not to pay the tax, he asks that someone, he needs a coin. Does anyone have a coin? And what's the coin? The coin that would be needed here would be this coin that we've just mentioned. And someone brings it and shows it to him. Now, right away, Jesus has tripped up people because a good Jew would not have in his possession a coin like this. So whoever it is, we're not sure who it is that produced this coin, but the person who did this put themselves in a shameful position because they were carrying, keep in mind, the image, and no images of God were to be made, and certainly they were not to be found in the temple area. So in a way, Jesus has kind of tricked now we're not sure whether it was a Pharisee or an Herodian that gave the coin, but since they're the ones that are setting up the deal, one would imagine that it was one of them that had this coin. And so when Jesus then says, now that he has the coin, whose image is on this? See, everybody in the audience knew whose image it was there, okay? And you are familiar with this because this same episode is also found in Mark with the coin. They liked this one. Well, Jesus says, then, after all, whose property is this coin? Well, it belongs to Caesar. It is his money. It is his coin. And so very cleverly, Jesus says, well, then give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So he's not taking a stance one way or the other, but he is saying, look, you don't want to have this coin, and if you do have it, give it to Caesar. If it pays the toll or the tax, well, all much to the better. But, and now he says, but let us give to God what is God's. And we've seen this before. When we talk in terms of image, well, if on the coin of the realm, that is of Rome, is the image of the Caesar, what is the coin of, where is the image of the coin of God to be found, if not on people? After all, God's image. And here there's a subtle, and remember that Matthew would probably appreciate this, a subtle reminder going all the way back to the story of creation in Genesis. When God decided to create humankind, he said, let us create them to our own image and likeness. Now, in Israel, there is no image of God as such, but here the words of God would seem to be that if you look to see what God is like or where God's image is to be found, it is to be found in the human, in us. And so very nicely when we think about it. This first challenge by the authorities to put Jesus in a bad light doesn't work. Jesus doesn't say don't pay the tax, because if he said don't pay the tax, that gets him in trouble with Rome. If he did say pay the tax, well, that puts him in kind of a bad position with regard to the people. What do you mean, be paying tax to this corrupt government? Why should we be doing this? It's wrong. And the complication, of course, I think, is to remember that by the time Matthew's gospel is written, and as we've noted already today, the temple no longer existed. So where's the money going? Well, if it's only the toll tax to the Roman government, that's one thing. If it's a tax still going, and the Pharisees were the leaders of Judaism at this time, if that temple tax were going to them, we're not sure whether or not that was still happening at this time. That almost put them in a shameful position. So Jesus is pictured here, as giving a kind of clever response to the attack that they hope to be leveling against Jesus. He says to pay the tax on the grounds, as we mentioned, that the coin doesn't belong to Israelites or to the Jewish people, but it belongs to Caesar. And if that's his money, well, then he should have it. And if you have it, you should be giving it to him. So all of that is the background for the little controversy story that we will be listening to this time. The first reading comes from the prophet Isaiah. Now, we've noticed on a number of occasions that the book of the prophet Isaiah is one of the longest books of prophets in terms of chapters. Perhaps it is the longest, and it is divided into three sections. It is what is called pre-exile, it is called exilic, and then it's called post-exilic, which means, when you think about it, that there may have been, probably were, different writers. So we probably are correct in assuming that the first 39 chapters, which make up what is called First Isaiah, was written by a prophet who bore that name. The other two sections would have been writers thinking in the same manner that the prophet Isaiah had, and perhaps even writing in the style of that prophet, but would not have been the original prophet. So you have really three Isaiahs writing, but all using the same cover or title. So the section that we hear this time, chapter 45, comes toward the end of the second Isaiah writer, and he would have been writing during the time of the exile, but we assume that the exile is about to end. See, so this little section of Isaiah is toward the end of second Isaiah, and the writer is writing this to give consolation and hope by the fact that there is, and now we're dealing with what Isaiah mentions is a royal decree. Second Isaiah, therefore, is composed in Babylon at the break of the release from captivity, which took place about the year 537-38 of the before the common time. So a return to the land of Israel will take place now. May not pay a lot of attention to this, from the east and from the north, which would have been the route, that Abraham, the great prophet, had taken when he had moved into the land of Israel. So Abraham is kind of always a model for writers in the Old Testament. Moses, of course, is the great thinker, but Abraham is kind of the honored patriarch. He, of course, is pictured to remember as the founder of of the Jewish community, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of course, are the three great patriarchs, whose stories are also narrated in the book of Genesis. So, what does Isaiah say here? Well, and here's, just so we see what he's doing, making a comparison that Darius, the king of Persia, is God's instrument. Darius came after him. Cyrus is God's vehicle for helping Israel. Now, what we know about Cyrus, by the way, is that he was a ruthless totalitarian king. And to have him pictured as God's anointed is a kind of twist that, of course, the writer Isaiah takes, that the Lord has indeed taken an unbelieving Israelite ruler and used him as the agent for God's helping to restore the Israelites back to their promised land. So that's the background a little bit for this. As we read this, and what is, well, the contrast here, I guess, the reason why this is chosen is the contrast between two outside rulers, Cyrus, the Persian, and Caesar, the Roman. Notice that they are both non-Jewish, and that may be why this particular reading is chosen for our consideration, to notice that distinction. I'm not quite sure, but that certainly is a very logical possibility. So again, important to notice, as we've noticed on a number of times, that in the ancient Mediterranean world, there is no separation of church and state. So sometimes this particular gospel has been used to develop that argument. And we're certainly, as Americans, we are familiar with the separation of church and state, and have not only laws and history and tradition about that, but in ancient times, that did not exist. Religion belonged to the state, belonged to the leader, belonged to the people. Again, just as a background, in listening to this section of both of Matthew as well as Isaiah, to keep that in mind. So you have a polytheistic leader, Cyrus, believing in other gods, and as we've mentioned on a number of occasions, keep in mind that the ancient people were all religious. This idea developed pretty much both by Christians and other writers later on of pagans is our vocabulary, but not however you think of pagan. But keep in mind that they believed in gods and goddesses. So here, interestingly, God uses Cyrus as his agent for bringing the people of Israel back to the promised land. Thus, the power of God is illustrated here and brought to the attention of the hearers in Isaiah's time, and certainly a reminder in our own time, that it is God alone, says the prophet, who arms Cyrus, though you know me not. See, Cyrus did not know the Lord. So God does use, and that's of course an important reminder, is it not, that we've seen on a number of occasions, the most unlikely human agents to carry out the divine will. And that link is, of course, very important to notice, and how often we see that. God uses unexpected persons and situations to carry out God's will, because God, after all, is Lord over all creation, and therefore nothing is without his or her ability to act and to save. Thank you for being with us this week, and hope to see you again.